Here we're looking at core 3 of 5, 67 of 8 west of the 6th. It is a shore face deposit of the Cardium Formation, or a partial shore face deposit of the Cardium Formation. And remember, the Cardium Formation is a sandy conglomeratic clastic wedge that formed within the coniation, the Turonian and coniation stages of the Lake Cretaceous along the western margin of the Alberta Foreland Basin. The clastic wedge is complex in that it has a lot of paraconformities and disconformities in it, so the stratigraphy can be more complicated than it looks, and the formation is well encased in a thick succession of black mudstones below the Blackstone and Cascapel formations and above the Wapiabi and Muskegee formations. And these formations provide some type of stratigraphic seal so that the Cardium has been a prolific oil and gas producer in western Alberta for many, many decades. But here we're looking at the Cardium for one of its very distinctive trace fossils, Macaronichnus. And the trace fossil, you can see quite readily on the image here, has a white core and a dark mantle. And that dark mantle and the white core are the same grain size, but they're slightly different composition in a sense. The white burrow-fill is quartz, and the dark grains are primarily chert. So they're compositionally similar, in fact, but the only difference between the two grains are some crystallographic characteristics. If we look closer at the Macaronichnus, you can see quite readily the dark grains that mantle the burrows. And it's a good question how those burrows, how the trace maker, the animal that makes Macaronichnus, actually makes these burrows. And does it do it hydraulically? Does it do it by active sorting? These are good questions, and we'll look at that very briefly in this small presentation. One thing I wanted to point out here first is the name, Macaronichnus. Have a closer look. Macaronichnus, named by Ed Clifton. Ed Clifton named it rather wittily, I would say, for its macaroni-like shape. And in 3 dimensions, these burrows commonly wind around each other. Something that was noticed, in fact, by Tom Saunders in the 80s and 90s when he did some of the initial behavioral studies of the trace fossil Macaronichnus, and was one of the first people to work on the modern on Macaronichnus. But a lot of that work remains unpublished. Let's have a closer look at these burrows. This is a thin section from the Blue Sky Formation, so not this core, another core, but you can see here, and these thin sections, by the way, were made by John Gordon, a fella who did his MSc with Pemberton and I about 14 years ago now, and he did this all on Macaronichnus and its permeability characteristics, which was fun. But look at the distribution of the chert versus the quartz. You can see that the chert is mantling all of the burrows and really defining the burrow fabric. Without the chert, you wouldn't see the bioturbation, would you? Look on the right where we emphasize just the chert just by changing the contrast of the image, and you can see quite readily the burrows just by looking at the distribution of chert grains, which is kind of pretty cool. So getting back to the question, how this was made. Well, back in 1996, January 96, Tom Saunders and myself went to the coast on a research trip, and we actually sampled some of the worms that make Macaronichnus. And with Mike Ranger back in George Pemberton's lab, we were all grad students at the time. Well, in fairness, Mike had just finished his PhD. Mike helped us make these videos. And these videos here show you the affiliate polychaete Euxonus mucronata actually moving through the sediment, ingesting grains. And you can see that's its mouth. In the mouth, it overts. It's like a big balloon that it expands with fluid pressure or blood pressure. And the balloon overts, and then when it collapses, it grabs the grains and pulls them into the animal's mouth and then gut. And you can see the slugs of sediment moving through the gut. Now, the worm actually moves this sediment all the way through its gut and backfills the burrow at its tail end where its anus is. And I think here you can actually see the anus. And you can see that it's sweeping around to distribute the grains. And so as the animal moves through the sediment, you actually get a sense of how some of the fabric occurs. And in fact, Macaronichnus is probably, for some reason or other, some hydraulic sorting of the quartz versus the chert grains. Admittedly, there's no specific gravity difference, but there might be grain shape differences that we need to study to understand why the chert grains are being swept aside. It's highly unlikely it's selective on the animal's part, because you saw how it feeds. With that big mouth sac, it appears to be quite indiscriminate. So going back to the core, let's just look at the trace fossil for what it is. A bunch of winding, generally non-interpenetrative traces that wrap around each other and locally sort the sediment and give this very, very distinctive pattern to the sandstone, making it inherently just beautiful. And I think, if you were to come to me and say, Macaronichnus is my favorite burrow because it's just so beautiful, I would totally get that.